seen the full force of techlash against some of the major tech companies and the full regulatory obviously scrutiny of these companies as we look at the impact that they have on society. But you'll be pleased to hear that this is not what we're here to talk about today. Today we would like to look at the impact and the role that technology can play in some of the issues that are perhaps a bit closer to the mission of the forum. How do we deal with the aging societies? How do we improve our healthcare and social care systems? How do we harness innovation and avoid some of its pitfalls? And most importantly, how do we deal with some of the ethical questions that inevitably will get raised as we incorporate technology into our lives? So given that we've got a lot to cover, we've got a bigger panel than our other panels, I'd like to divide this session into technologies that are in existence today, technologies that will be used in the near future, and then the ones that have the potential to be used in the kind of further future, looking at the obviously 10-year horizon, given the topic of the forum today is longevity 2030. So Mubasher, I'd like to start with you, if I may, in terms of the technologies that are used today and how they're being used to improve healthcare. And in particular, I was wondering if you could tell us what you're doing at Babylon, but also how do you see that space evolving moving forward?
Sure, thank you. So I think what we're really focusing on at Babylon is using artificial intelligence at the heart of delivery of healthcare. And we've been doing that for about 5 years, starting off as a small London-based startup, but have taken that technology to all different parts of the world, so developing country settings like Rwanda, as well as developed country settings such as Canada, parts of the Middle East. And we've localized that technology so it's accessible to patients all over the world in their local language and in a language that resonates with them. And I think we've focused on using technology, I guess, really in 2 ways. So one is how to help patients when they're sick, and so how to help them identify using an application on their phone what their symptoms might mean, what action they need to take for these symptoms, where do they need to go, what kind of place of care do they need to attend. And that helps with making sure people get to care in a timely way and ultimately with the aim of improving health outcomes. We've also tried to think about if people actually need to see a doctor, how can we connect them more easily to a clinician? And so allowing them to have a consultation with a clinician through their smartphone. We've had to adapt that when we went to places like Rwanda because, of course, smartphone penetration is low, and so we had to work with the existing healthcare infrastructure and think about how you could make such services available on a basic feature phone, which we've also done. Now, of course, helping people when they're sick is just one component of healthcare, and so another big focus area for us has also been thinking about how to prevent people from becoming sick, how to help them stay healthy and live longer, healthier lives. And so in that regard, we've been using technology to help people identify risk of future diseases. Now, of course, that's not new. It's possible to go and have an expensive health assessment at numerous places around the country. We do that in the NHS periodically. But of course, it's been, the challenge of getting people to do that and getting people to do that in an affordable way is difficult. So what we've done with that is to try and create a really comprehensive way of assessing your health just using your phone, but really bringing that to life. So creating a representation of the patient, which we call a digital twin. Now, digital twins have been around for many years in lots of different industries, and all it means is, essentially a digital replica of what exists today. But the brilliant thing about that is, once you've got that, you can start simulating different environmental conditions and seeing how your digital twin would perform under those different circumstances. Now, if you map that to healthcare, you can see, once you give someone a digital twin of their body, they can zoom in on their lungs and they can start simulating things like, well, what would happen to my lung health if I don't stop smoking? What would happen to my cardiovascular health if I don't reduce cholesterol? Giving them a really powerful way of not only knowing what's happening inside their body, but we've also worked with behavioral psychologists to think about how can we use this type of technology to nudge different types of behavior to help change behaviors so that people can ultimately improve their health outcomes.
And I'd like to move the conversation now into social care, Camilla, if I may. You've written a lot about this in your book, and in particular you talked about the demographic time bomb that we're all sitting on, and also the fact that you know, when you were researching this topic, you went to Japan and encountered some useful but cold robots, you said. So I was just wondering whether you think we are at a stage where we can actually incorporate, given the issues that we have in social care, whether we're at a stage where we can incorporate robots into social care, and where does that leave some of the core skills that we need, such as human empathy in those professions?
Well, first of all, I'd say I keep challenging this notion that we are sitting on a demographic time bomb. I mean, you know, part of what I'm trying to do, which a lot of us are trying to do, is to explain to people that we need to be far less fatalistic about the future, and that at almost any age you can actually change your risk profile. And we've heard some fairly, you know, simple examples of that in the sessions that I've been in. And I mean, I called my book Extra Time because I think it's not old age that's getting longer, it's middle age. And we're in this extra time. We then have all these amazing therapies that some people have already talked about, which may be able to accelerate, you know, reduce senescence further. And so I'm just worried about the phrase, because actually I'm trying to sort of challenge that. And I do think with social care in this country, we've got into a very fatalistic position where we simply have these graphs that everything's getting worse, where we assume that once someone has moved into a certain bracket, they're in a state of inevitable decline. And in fact, what our systems should be doing, I think, is focusing much more intently on the line between independence and dependence. We just let people fall across that line too quickly, and then once they've fallen across that line, we basically say, well, we kind of got to get them out of bed and get them dressed, but beyond that, we have no ambitions for them, whatever. And this is actually quite a live debate at the moment in the UK election. I mean, it's not outwardly a live debate, but it is internally between the parties as they look at their manifestos. Sorry, which is a long-winded way of coming to your question about Japan. So yes, I mean, personally, when you come to social care, I'm actually quite a fan of low-tech. So the exoskeletons that actually are revolutionizing car companies, for example, are revolutionizing manufacturing because they're able to boost your muscle power. Those things will revolutionize caring because they will enable professional staff and any of us to actually lift somebody. You know, there's a Panasonic bed that changed into a wheelchair without you having to lift anybody. Those things are actually revolutionary. They're not terribly exciting. They're not as exciting as genomics, but actually I think they will have, in terms of cost benefit, a really substantial effect. In terms of where Japan is going with companions robots, which is really interesting, robots that will actually be able to sense your mood, will be able to pick up on your blood pressure, will be able to sit. There's a wonderful thing that's basically a mobile phone that can sit on your bedside table and say, hey, it's a good time to get up and have a walk because it's a beautiful day, because it's already sensed, you know, some of your vital signs. Those things could be, they're having a big impact on dementia patients, who, by the way, will copy a pepper robot. You know, you can see a human being standing next to a pepper robot. Some of you have seen this. And the human physio is doing the actions, but the old people are watching the robot, and they're doing the actions with the robot. And that's kind of, I mean, it's slightly disgruntling for the human being. Those things are really important. But I suppose what I've become slightly concerned about is that we don't lose sight of the humans. And I think when we talk about technology, I guess with a policy hat on, I've spent a lot of my life looking at how humans can trip things up. Humans have a brilliant ability to trip up the best discoveries. And in fact, trust in data, you know, today's story about Google and health sites is one of, you know, humans don't actually trust companies. They don't want to give, they didn't like the fact that the Royal Free Hospital gave 1.6 million patients' data to DeepMind. Now, we might all believe that's really important because we need big data to get ahead and do clinical trials, but you've got to kind of deal with the human element. Well, the same applies, I think, in social care, where actually, weirdly, if you look at what we've done in hospitals and caring for years, we've used blood pressure monitors, which you can just put on someone's arm and they can walk away. And they do, they walk away. They do not use that opportunity to have a conversation and build a relationship with the patient. So I guess, you know, that's all I'd say, is that health outcomes, we all know that health outcomes are very linked to people's sense of well-being and human relationships. My dad always said that the only thing left to you when you're old is being able to complain. The greatest joy is being able to complain. And I just have to imagine how he would get on if he was left alone with a companion robot, which would basically be telling him, don't snack on the train, don't watch that television program, and feel good about yourself. So we have to come to a better place on this.
James, I really want to hear in terms of the gene editing being a particularly pertinent near future application. Obviously, we've all heard the case of the Chinese twin babies and the intervention there, and also there are other cases of other scientists looking to apply gene editing, perhaps beyond the germline gene editing, beyond the scope of what is perhaps acceptable in the regulatory community, but also in the medical and science community. Could you just maybe let us know where we are in terms of the legal and the ethical debate on these areas? And also, I'm quite interested to see whether there are any regulatory arbitrage opportunities moving forward that you see developing, especially as we look at the kind of the 10-year horizon.
Yeah, well, it's a very good and topical question. Genome editing is, I think, a hugely exciting area, both for research as a research tool, but also in terms of tackling currently untreatable diseases. And I can't think in my lifetime of another technology that has moved so rapidly as genome editing has. So many papers being published and so many people all over the world using this technique in the lab. There is, I'd say, an international consensus, scientific consensus, that it's too soon to take it from the lab into clinical use. And unfortunately, there are some who've ignored that consensus and pushed to use it in germline use and have made that public, and others who are saying that they want to continue to do that. And the reason I say that's unfortunate is because there's still a lot of anxiety about the safety of the technique and the consequences, and that's happening in society where many regard it as hugely contentious to alter the human genome in a permanent way, in the way that that's been done in China. And the reason that's of concern to me is there's a natural tendency in government and amongst policymakers to be very precautionary about technologies like this. And that leads to the risk of it being banned, or at least hugely restricted. And we've already seen that in quite a few jurisdictions who have imposed bans on the use of this in human embryos. And unfortunately, I can't stay for the rest of the afternoon because I have to go to the National Gallery to give evidence to the International Commission on germline genome editing, who are looking to develop a global framework that will help govern the responsible and robust use of germline gene editing, both in the lab and ultimately, if it proves to be safe and efficacious, in clinical practice. But that is an enormous challenge. And there will always, I put my cards on the table, I'm not optimistic that it's possible to do that, because there will always be countries, either because they're distracted by other social concerns who just don't have laws that govern this, or those that actually see it as an opportunity, and that they will press ahead despite the fact that it's contentious and disapproved by many others. So I think there's a real urgency at the moment to tackle this, because bringing it home, the UK has a really mature and robust regulatory framework that allows us to develop cell and gene therapies in a responsible, ethically approved way, targeted at particular diseases. And it would be a great shame if we were in any way compromised or stymied in the way that we develop products and therapies here because of that international concern. There's no need for us to ban anything. We don't allow the use of germline genome editing in clinical use at the moment, but we do allow it in the lab, which is what the Cricket does.
But what about this arbitrage opportunities? We talked, someone compared germline gene editing to building an atomic bomb. It's ethically questionable, but it won't stop people from actually building it. So,
exactly.
How do we deal? We're in a global system. We're interdependent. You know, countries are competing for resources, for knowledge, for talent, for basically finding that competitive edge. And when you have countries such as China, and I'm not saying that China is condoning the use of, officially they're not, but in terms of how do we deal with these countries, and our standards, our global standards, like for example what WHO is doing, are they enough to actually prevent this misuse of technology?
I certainly think they're a very important step in the right direction, because if nothing more, they make it clear that clinical use of this technology is irresponsible today. and that anybody that does that should be reprimanded and held accountable for what they've decided to do. I don't think that there is no such thing as international law that applies internationally. It's up to different countries to sign up to different treaties and laws. But that way, and the registry that the WHO want to set up will hopefully allow patients to look to see that this is either something that's been approved and is public, transparent, and on their register, or not, and therefore they should be cautious about that. But that leads to a vital second point, which is that there needs to be transparency and dialogue between scientists and doctors and parliamentarians and policymakers in the UK and internationally, not just here.
I'd like to move the discussion a little bit into known unknowns, especially Stephen. I think you warned about a lot of the issues that we're facing today back in your book in 2012, 2013. But being an optimist, or half optimist, you've decided to actually maybe do something about it and use the power of science to actually find solutions to some of the critical challenges we face, like the environment, the water shortages, and so forth. Could you let us know how do you see the application of technology over the next 10 years in resolving those basic human needs?
Yes, I have a horrible feeling, by the way, that this is the point in the conference where in about 30 seconds everyone's going to be thinking, why the hell has this bloke been invited? But I will,
because we had a good chat
I will do my best to avoid that. So I think in order to answer the question of, what's the title of the topic? Technologies that will shape the future of humanity over the next decade, we first have to ask the question, what is going to shape humanity overall over the next 7 decades? And without question, the one thing that's going to shape the future of humanity over the next few decades is the world's biggest experiment. And anyone who thinks that that's the Large Hadron Collider at CERN is sadly mistaken, because the biggest experiment and the most important experiment on Earth is the experiment that every single person in this room and this planet is conducting right now, which is on Earth itself. And the outcome of that, we don't really know. We have some models to go on, but what we do know is it's not going to be good. And by the way, future humanity, I include human health, which is the topic of this conference. So I'm sort of clinging on in there with my fingertips. And that experiment really is at the intersection of population growth. You know, the things that we've talked about in this conference so far really refer to a quite small number of people on this planet, certainly not all 7 billion of them, or 7.5 billion, and certainly not the 10 billion that are going to be on the planet in 50 years or something. But the intersection of human population growth, the consumption of that population, consumption of energy primarily, consumption of food, transportation of all of those things, plus consumption of a whole range of things that we don't actually need, so just like nonsense. And the impact of that population and its consumption on climate, on the global carbon cycle, on land use change, and the availability of food. And that's setting aside lower ones like pollution, but they're big. They're probably going to be big ones. And it is worth reminding ourselves that we are all currently altering fundamentally every single component of Earth's life support system as we speak. Just take carbon dioxide, which we're all fixated with for some understandable reasons, is we're experiencing, every living thing on this planet is experiencing a level of carbon dioxide that's not been on this planet for about 6 million years, and absolutely no one has any clue what's going to be the outcome of that, but it's not going, everyone does know it's not going to be good. And it's also worth reminding ourselves when we talk about population, especially in increasing urbanization, that we have hundreds of millions of people, and it could be over 1 billion people by 2050, that are living in exceptionally close proximity, sometimes in the same room as pigs and poultry. And the reason why that's important is because the biggest killer of the 20th century wasn't cardiovascular disease or anything. It was the Spanish flu pandemic. It was originally thought that it killed 50 million people. It now is well agreed that it killed over 100 million people in very short order. And all of those people were healthy young adults. They weren't the infirm, they weren't the elderly. And most epidemiologists would say it's not if we have another similar pandemic, it's when we have another similar pandemic. And one of the more questionable innovations of the 20th and 21st century, which is EasyJet, is going, and the way in which we all fly around the planet is going to make the possibility of the next Spanish flu pandemic, or whatever it's called, actually maybe wipe out billion and a half people. Well, there aren't going to be many Tesco's open at that point, I can tell you. And so all bets are off about what we're doing in this massive experiment. But we do know it's not going to have a good outcome.
Well, I'm glad I seated you next to Anders with catastrophic risk bracket. And so, Anders, could you tell us a little bit about the types of risks, low probability but high impact risks that you're looking at? And I was hoping you could also just tell the audience a little bit about superintelligence and where we are with its development, and also some of the risks of... Only 5 minutes, and the risk of harmful AI.
Yeah. So it's interesting to notice that you just managed to come up to the level where I normally start paying attention. Oh, 1 billion dead. Okay, now it's time for us to start thinking about it. Below that, yeah, that's just a bad day. So what's interesting, yes, we get rather skewed priorities at our institute. The Future of Humanity Institute is about the total long-term future, which means that we're mostly interested in existential threats that would totally wipe us out or be about as bad. But of course, global catastrophic risks can be really bad too. Nobody is going to directly die, well, relatively few people are going to directly die from climate change. But it puts a lot of pressure on other important systems. It allows other risks and cascades to happen to make things work. It's still worth noticing that in the list of kind of bad things that could wreck our picnic, nuclear war is still up there. We still need to fix that. We have our big systemic faults that we need to handle. There are also emerging risks, and these are the ones we mainly try to think about, because there are a lot of excellent people already working on the great challenges of the normal kind. But emerging technologies people typically don't have much clue about, and it might be also quite possible to shape their development in order to avoid the worst thing. So in particular, our institute have been very interested in the question of artificial intelligence, and in particular superintelligence. Now, the realm of AI safety stretches from how to make industrial robots not to squish workers over to the other end, where we tend to think, what if we actually succeed in making something much, much smarter than a human? And given that humans, by being slightly smarter than chimpanzees, have taken over the planet and totally transformed it into a big experiment, that doesn't quite bode well, assuming we don't know how to get a very smart system to behave itself, which is really the core of that interest. But turning around and thinking, what kind of machine learning and the AI would actually affect the aging we're talking about? The most obvious thing is, of course, everybody today is using machine learning to try to sift through data and find patterns. And that is not going to rebel in another sense than it's just giving us correlation. We're getting awfully good at diagnosing patterns, but that doesn't tell us much about what to do about them. So I think one of the really interesting challenges for AI is actually to intervene. Indeed, a lot of the criticism that is coming right now against the deep learning paradigm is that it's all about correlation rather than causation. It doesn't understand what causes what, it just notices patterns. And then hopefully we step in as intelligent beings, on some days at least, and try to learn from that and figure out what to do. But ideally you want systems that can figure out, if I do this, that actually happens. But in order to do that, you can't just sit in your armchair like an Oxford philosopher or sit in your server like a typical machine learning system. You actually need to interact with the world and do experiments. This is partially what's going on at Silicon Roundabout with the experiments in reinforcement learning. There, the experiments are virtual agents running around playing chess or playing computer games. They're doing different things and learning what works out and what doesn't work out. And we probably, if we want to really get the power of AI to help us in our endeavor, we need to allow it to act in the lab. This is, of course, going to be tricky because we don't want it anywhere close to our patients, because the typical failure mode of these machine learning paradigms is that you set up a reward function that you think makes sense. And then the system figures out a crazy way of maximizing its points without solving the problem we care about. A typical example is a racing game where a human player would try to race as quickly around the board as possible, but there are little bonus stars. And the machine learning systems happily realize, if I just loop around forever, gathering little stars rather than winning the race, I get a higher score. We don't want that to happen with aging. But lab automation combined with reinforcement learning is potentially very powerful. There are some very intriguing results I've seen where people have been using machine learning to learn what's going on in cells, again, not in a human representation, but learn how to manipulate cells into particular states. What we really dream about is, of course, one day that our software will tell us, oh, if you do this and that, then this beneficial thing will happen. That's much further away. We're partially getting, but thanks to the EU. Besides all the other lovely things the EU has done to us, I'm an EU citizen myself, it's also that whole debate about explainability that is actually forcing us to think about how do we get valuable information out of these dense pieces of a neural network. That is important not just in order to reassure people that they got the right medication and the right decision, but also for us to find scientific theories. And it's also tremendously hard and exciting for philosophers and engineers to get to. So in the long run, I do think that when we really start getting rolling on fixing aging, we are going to find that there are going to be quite a lot of AI programs involved in a lab. Probably the medicine Nobel Prize is still going to go to the humans, but they're probably going to be thanking some piece of software in their acceptance speech.
I'd like to just go back to Slido for some audience interaction. For the next question, which is, what is the biggest threat to humanity posed by technology over the next decade, just given what you heard here today? Slido.com #longevity. That's interesting. So this is something that we probably anticipated given where we'd like to take the debate next, looking at the technologies that, if there was one thing in the technology space that could improve humans' experience of life and also reduce inequality, what would that be? Question for the panel. Anders, would you like to go?
So one of the best heuristics I ever heard, I got from Ramez Nam, a transhumanist environmentalist, and he pointed out that if you have a human enhancement and it's a pill and a gadget, it tends to come down exponentially in price. If it's a service, the price tends to stay roughly the same because you need to pay the doctors and nurses. If you can turn any human enhancement technology into more of a gadget and pill, it's easier to distribute widely. If it has to involve people with salaries, it's going to be harder to equalize.
Similarly, Mubasher, in terms of economies of scale, you mentioned you've got your application in different countries. Where have you seen the biggest impact? And have you seen economies of scale as a result of having this
I think
line across different countries?
certainly one of the places we've seen biggest impact is in Rwanda, actually, where there's been massive adoption of it. And I guess that's obviously improved accessibility and affordability of the healthcare. But it's interesting, there's been other benefits which, perhaps were unforeseen. So a good example is in Rwanda, everyone has to make a co-payment for their care, even if they're quite poor. And traditionally, that's done, in a healthcare facility where you might see, a huge long queue to see a doctor or nurse, but then a similar-sized queue to make your co-payment, because it's simply someone sitting in a small outbuilding taking a cash payment. Now, with the ability to actually use mobile money to make that payment in seconds, it's significantly reduced the opportunity cost for that patient. If they're sat at a hospital for 8 hours, essentially they're losing a lot of income. And so I think it's places, certainly places like Rwanda, so developing country settings where we've seen huge impact of the technology.
Stephen, you talked about the widening inequality and just given the issues that we're facing. There are some particular parts of science that you're keen to perhaps deploy in resolving some of these issues, including the inequality that we face in terms of environment or access to resources. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, of course. Well, it is just, again, worth reminding ourselves, because these are big numbers, that it's quite possible. I mean, we do need better climate models and better ecological models, but given what's happening to the climate and ecosystem structure and function degradation, desertification, land use change, groundwater depletion, all the rest of it, I think we can be fairly certain that what we're seeing currently is going to just exponentially rise in terms of consequences of climate change, ecological degradation. And I don't mean just loss of biodiversity, because I couldn't really care less about polar bears or white rhinos. I can care less about ecosystem structure and function, because they provide the things that we rely upon for our survival and many other species. The reason why I say that is I think there's every potential for this to be massive. And you Anders was saying, if you're talking a billion, you're talking my numbers. Well, fine. I think that we are possibly looking at we're already looking at around 1 billion people who don't have access to clean water, don't have access to enough food. And that could actually easily be 3 billion. And they won't all be in Africa, and they won't all be in Southeast Asia. Some of these people are probably going to be in Europe. You know, let's not forget that Ukraine is one of the key breadbaskets of Europe, and that country is finished in terms of climate change for being able to produce for future of agriculture. So the question is, what do we do? Can we do about that? Well, what's interesting is that the current, let's call it software revolution, has had almost no impact whatsoever on the things that are causing us a lot of grief. It hasn't had much impact on the petrochemical industry, except to make it worse by making exploration more effective and more efficient for yet more oil, coal and gas. And it hasn't had much impact on agriculture, despite this rapid rise of precision agriculture and all the rest of it, and agrimetrics. So that's quite interesting, that this enormous thing that's in some way shaped the 20th century, the software revolution, hasn't had any effect on these things that are actually going to shape the 21st century, these big issues like energy, agriculture, water, land use. But there is another software revolution on its way. It doesn't exist yet, but my lab pioneered this. I'd worked in Microsoft, right? It's a software company. And we got quite a long way. And it's I think it was Jim this morning who gave this lovely slide about, we learnt how to read biology in the 1990s. It was mapping the human genome. We learnt how to write biology in the noughties. We can now cut and paste biology with CRISPR-Cas9. Well, the ultimate end of that is going to be the ability to program biology. And that's going to be a big one. And the culmination of that living software revolution isn't going to be teenagers sending naked pictures of each other, which depressingly seems to be the apex of the current software revolution. It's going to completely transform energy, agriculture, medicine, and goes a long way to many of the topics that we discussed today about being able, for example, to be able to program the immune system. Well, I'm actually a bit more interested in being able to program the immune system of plants, which we normally call crops. I'm not interested in sort of lilies or anything. I'm sort of interested in wheat and maize and all the rest of it. Being able to program crops is going to be necessary. We need to be able to program the immune system and the photosynthetic machinery of plants, so the photosynthetic machinery doesn't close down with contiguous drought, heat, extreme days, because once that photosynthetic machinery closes down, the plant dies, or at least it doesn't flower, i.e. produce grains that we can use. There's a range of fungal pathogens emerging, which, because we've bred almost all genetic diversity out of crops, the so-called green revolution, we've had to rely on fungicides, pesticides and herbicides, but fungicides is a big one. There's a range, a bit like antimicrobial resistance, there's a range of fungal pathogens emerging which have the potential to totally wipe out much of the world's crops. And out of the 17 class of triazoles that we've relied upon for 30 years in the Green Revolution, only 2 are now effective. And if you speak to someone at BASF or Bayer, they say, we are in trouble because we don't have anything to fix this problem. So how might this living software revolution, and it's coming, fix that? Well, the ability to actually, as I say, program crops would be a big one. But on the energy front, the technology which is going to shape humanity over the next decade, unless we do something urgently, is power stations, is our continuing reliance on oil, coal and gas. Now, we might be able to fix that with solar panels. I doubt it, because even the next generation of silicon photovoltaics is laughably inefficient at like 19%. They're anything but green or clean to produce. And wind power, all bets are off about whether that's going to meet expectations and hype. But there is a way of harvesting sun's light, and there's enough sunlight falls on Earth every day to power more than a population of 10 billion. And plants own 3 billion years of R&D have figured out a very good way of actually doing that. It's called photosynthesis. And if we could actually figure out how plants do photosynthesis and replicate that, so artificial photosynthesis, with the same efficiency, there's every possibility of having a very massive breakthrough energy technology, which would be very cheap, based upon being able to program artificial photosynthesis in a biomimetic material, I don't mean real plants. And that could actually completely revolutionize energy. And I think it was Jim again said, we're in an area where this is a $150 billion market. Well, the energy market is currently about 9 trillion, and by 2030, it's going to be about 15 trillion. And that's quite a big market to actually get involved in. Now, the whole green tech thing fell apart on the clean tech, but I think there's opportunity to do something really quite remarkable in actually doing something like artificial photosynthesis as an energy.
Well, what strikes me is there's a huge amount of innovation out there, technological innovation touching all different areas of life, and I'm just interested to understand, maybe Camilla, you and James could talk a little bit about your experience. Camilla, your experience in Downing Street Policy Unit, and how hard it is to actually harness the power of these innovations and then translate them into policy and then application in real life. And then James, if you could talk a little bit about your experience also in the regulatory environment and in bringing these technologies and making them acceptable in real life.
Yeah, I'm still just grappling with the thought of artificial photosynthesis, sorry. I was lecturing at Harvard Medical School a few weeks ago on a sort of public health program, and I'm now mentoring a couple of physicians as a result of that, and one of them has a lot of experience in places like Nepal and Bangladesh, and what he has seen is families, he's actually, he's been treating families for dengue, who he then realized have actually moved countries. And it's a result of what you're saying. So this is, we are seeing this at a public health level. But I mean, look, all of these problems are cross-boundary problems which go across very long timescales, which democratic governments can't grapple with, right? I mean, the awful thought that occurs when we have these kind of conversations is, do we just need a world government? And, George Monbiot has argued for this for years, and I've argued against it strenuously for all the obvious reasons that I kind of like freedom. But I mean, I actually, we see time and time again that it is almost impossible for democratic governments to come together to solve any serious cross-boundary problems. And I mean, the response of the EU to climate, which they've grappled with for 20 years. I mean, Germany is mining more coal now than it was 10 years ago. I mean, these are disastrous. We have endless committees and summits, and they don't work. And, look, if we just boil it down to its essentials, I mean, the reason for that is that until you have significant public support for something, almost no politician is going to move on it. I mean, that's the truth. I mean, you cannot go too far ahead of public opinion if you're a politician in a democratic country, because you will be voted out. And leadership is very, very important, but it only takes you so far. So I think, you always have to remember that you might be able to convince the top guy, but unless you can convince the public, and that means convincing the press, of which I am a member, you're not going to get very far. And I hope that doesn't sound sort of fatalistic, but actually I think, I mean, I've been a campaigner for many years and on various issues, and I always find that essentially, yes, you have to make the rational argument, and you have to show politicians, by the way, how something can work. But you also really have to remember that you have to go to where people are today, and you have to explain, you have to deal with their fears. And so I was discussing with these doctors at Harvard Medical School, I was using the example of anti-vax. So I was talking about how we introduced the sugar tax when I was in number 10. It was one of my policies on fizzy drinks. It was a tremendous battle. And I was using anti-vaxxers as an alternative example. And so many of those people were saying, yeah, I find it that actually we failed to connect with what our patients were really worried about. And actually, when I go to sit down with the patients, I understand what their fears are. I can have the conversation. But I think on too many of these things, we in this room are running very far ahead of public opinion or public understanding. I mean, the germline type thing is a brilliant example. And I think we need to put some serious thought into how to catch people up.
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions I'm asked most commonly as a lawyer working in life sciences is how does the law keep up with the rapid progress of science? And genome editing is a really good example of that. I think one of the key answers is that it doesn't always, but when it does, it's because it's drafted in a way that's sort of future-proofed. And we're quite good in the UK at drafting legislation which allows for developments. So we don't make it too restrictive, we don't make it sort of technology specific, and we don't use terms which you see in a lot of European legislation like eugenics, or the rather more emotive language that is capable of huge, broad interpretation. And I think probably my happiest and the best success story I can think of along the lines that you were referring to is the progress of mitochondrial donation and transfer. So for those of you who don't know, it's mitochondrial diseases are inherited down the female line. They're often horrific, and if children are born at all, they have short, painful lives. And a team in Newcastle developed a way or concept of avoiding the transmission of mitochondrial disease by taking the nucleus from a fertilized egg and affected by mitochondrial disease and transferring it to an egg with healthy mitochondria from a donor, what the Daily Mail called 3 parent babies. And this was groundbreaking. It was hugely controversial, and many people said it shouldn't be allowed. They applied for a license in 2004 and were initially refused. And then after many years of research, went to government and said, we think we're ready to go into the clinic. And eventually, in 2017, they were granted a license to actually use this in treatment. And I was at a conference yesterday in Oxford where someone from Newcastle talked about the progress that they've made in actually using this in the clinic. Now, that was facilitated by having a legal system that permitted that after a change in the law. It was vital for there to be huge efforts in public engagement and engagement with parliamentarians so that they understood why this superficially hugely controversial technology should be made legal. It did require some legal challenge, but ultimately it required patience. It took 13 years to take that concept from the lab to the clinic. Now, you could say that's far too long, and with genome editing, that's not going to work. We can't possibly take 13 years to make our mind up about what to do, but it can be done.
And just one final thought from you maybe on the ethical dilemmas that we face when we deal with issues like gene editing, designer babies, reparent babies, so forth.
So if policy and law has problem with technology getting ahead, then of course the standard cliche is saying ethics can't keep up. And to some extent that might be less of a problem because ethics is fairly impotent. In fact, many of our medical ethics and human rights rules that exist in the world today were first formulated as lawyers as a result of a Second World War. And then the ethicists came in and kind of came up with various explanations for why this is true. And then the ethicists got into an interesting quarrel because they found very different answers. But typically what happens in ethics is that it responds to what you actually have. Good ethics thinks a bit ahead and might help people come up with sensible responses when new technology should show up. But generally, in order to actually convince people that one should have a technology, it needs to be shown to be useful and good. People typically accept useful things even when they're not good. That's why even though everybody has a bit of climate change these days, they're still living in concrete buildings and driving cars. But the thing is, if a technology is there an option not to use it or not accept it, if it doesn't look good, then people will abstain from it. So this is where the public opinion comes in, and this is where ethics also plays a role. Does this technology provide something that's important to us? Does it break important ideas about our worldview? And typically when I get into discussions about life extension, I find that they are much more fierce than many of the other conversations I have about cognitive enhancement and cyborgs and really weird stuff. People have no problem with cyborgs. But living to 200, suddenly people start rattling off their standard arguments. Why are they doing it? Because it's easy to knock over these arguments, but then new arguments come in. Well, actually, it's about the shape of life. It's a worldview on how things are supposed to work. And what to do is, of course, trying to deal with that worldview, which is typically not what you can do in a quick panel conversation or a quick question and answer session on Twitter or something like that. But this is where we actually need to work. We actually need to show what kind of worldview, what kind of pattern and shape of life are possible here. This is probably why we actually need to have a fair bit of artists and other poets involved. The problem is most artists and poets get involved in projects like this by somebody saying, oh, it would be great to have them. They come in and they realize it's best for my career to look critical. They don't really know that much about the question. They know we're getting paid for producing something, so we whip off something that's critical about the ennui of living forever. It's been done before, it's cliche, but it's so easy to do. Actually engaging with the question, how would you organize a multi-century lifespan? How do you handle when you're actually going to run into a middle-aged Greta Thunberg a few decades from now who asks you, you're still you for yourself, what did you do in 2020s? That is potentially an interesting story, but it requires actually people wanting to engage with these scenarios. This is an ongoing thing, and I think it's up for all of us. Most of us have another hat. We're scientists, we're in academics, we're in entrepreneurs, we're lawyers, we're trying to do that thing. But we also actually need to be active in our imagination. Because the final thing I want to say is, if you read an ethics paper, at least one of the pluses of ethics is that they typically have a horrifying or exhilarating thought experiment. They're very good at coming up with a little story and playing around with that story. And we need to do that much more. We need to actually play around with stories. Because storytelling is one of the most ancient technologies we have. It might not be new and fancy like protein engineering or synthetic biology or AI, but it's powerful.
Agreed, and that's really what we're trying to do here with the mission of bringing people together and telling stories and engaging and then turning that hopefully into action. Just on the topic of ethical decision making, before we close, I just wanted to mention we have a great exercise donated to us by Mind Gym, Joanne Cash of Mind Gym, which actually takes people through the process of how you make ethical decisions in your corporate day-to-day life. So we encourage all participants to download it. Hopefully you've received that with your confirmations. But thank you all to all the panelists today. Thank you to all for staying through lunch. And